Welcome to the second teaching for Forgiving What You Can't Forget. Today we're looking at chapters 3 and 4, and as we get started today, I just want to acknowledge that for some of you, maybe this material hits pretty close to home. You can maybe easily identify ways that people have hurt you, maybe things that need to be forgiven. And then there are others of you, and you're not having that kind of an experience right now. Maybe if you're doing this as a group study, you might have both experiences happening in the middle of someone's living room. It could also be true that there are people in your same group who maybe have a similar experience, but one person is having a relatively easy time forgiving, and another person is really struggling. So I just want to tell you here before we get started that no matter what your experience is, that is totally okay. And I just want to encourage you to make space for all the ways that someone might be experiencing this material. As you continue on through here for the next several weeks, I ask you to resist the temptation to judge the experience that someone else is having. Maybe you don't understand the thoughts and emotions that someone is having as they go through this. Maybe you think their thoughts and their feelings are too big, or maybe you think they're not big enough. But just love one another enough to simply make space for the range of things that might be going on with folks today. Okay, let's get started. In chapter 3, Lisa is continuing to build the case for why forgiveness is the better way. Better than demanding retribution, better than sulking, better than waiting for the other person to come around. Whatever it is, forgiveness is better. And really the crux of this argument is what she says on page 29, and I'm going to read that to you. She says, if healing hasn't been worked out and forgiveness hasn't been walked out, chaos is what will continue to play out. And another way to say that is this. If you don't deal with the pain in your life, eventually that pain is going to deal with you. You can say it another way. Hurt people hurt people. I've not made it a secret that I've walked through some of these things in my life as well. And I hate to tell you this, but I have a very specific memory of losing my temper. I wasn't dealing with my pain, and my pain was certainly dealing with me. And as I was blowing my top, and that release felt good to me in the moment, but I saw the look on that other human being's face who wasn't even a part of it in response to me losing my temper. And I knew then that the pain that was in me was overflowing and it was leaking out. And if this continued to go on, people who I desperately didn't want to hurt were absolutely going to get hurt. And then they would be in a place where they could hurt people. And I knew that this storm of chaos could potentially ensue from that. I didn't want that. I didn't want to give away so much of my own power and autonomy to the person who had hurt me. And even more than that, I knew that if I built up this anger and resentment and bitterness such that now then I would become an agent of hurt for someone else, for another person, then I knew that that made me no different than the person who had hurt me. And as I said, I didn't want any of that. When I realized the downstream effects on the people around me of not dealing with the pain, and when you realize the effects on the people around you, that's the point where things actually get pretty straightforward. And then you know that the only answer is forgiveness, because it's the only way to cut off that chain reaction of hurt and chaos. And if it's better for the people in your life who you love, then friend, it's probably better for you too. So moving on to chapter 4. Hopefully by now we agree that forgiveness is the better way, but it's easy to get stuck in this space of, on one hand, knowing what you need to do, but then on the other hand, not knowing where to start. So to begin this chapter, Lisa asks the question, how is forgiveness even possible when I feel like this? When you have that knot of anger or fear or desperation, when that's true for you, how do you actually step forward when those feelings are still really there and really raw? And then shortly after that comes this sense that you shouldn't even have to do all this work because you're not the one who made the mess, right? And when those thoughts start to creep in, it can truly keep you stuck and keep you hostage in your anger and in your pain. Now listen, I do want to talk about feelings because it's really important. But before we do that, I want to take us on kind of a little bit of a detour deep into the Old Testament. Trust me, it's all going to come together here in a minute. We're going to go all the way back to Leviticus, the third book in the Old Testament. And there's a reasonably good chance that when you arrive at Leviticus in your reading plan for the year, or maybe it's in your daily Bible reading, whatever, you probably skim it. There's a whole lot going on there in Leviticus, and so I totally get it. So if you're not familiar with it, the early chapters 1 through 5 or so, have to do with the offerings that were required to atone for the people's sins. Now, it was assumed that these offerings would be made at regular intervals because we all sin, and people were no different back in Leviticus. So there were different festivals and different times of year where these offerings were just made and these sacrifices were just made. But if you were to look closely at this text, and if you read the instructions for what the priests were supposed to do with the offerings and how these offerings were to be presented, if you read it, and if in your mind you kind of imagine how all of this might go on, you would come to the conclusion that by the time the priests were done with this work of presenting sacrifices for the people's sin, what I'm about to say is kind of gruesome, and I'm sorry. But by the time the priests were done with their work, they would have been covered. They would have been covered in the blood of these animals from head to toe. Now, if that's a lot for you to think about, just imagine that it's glitter, right? We all know how glitter gets everywhere. And I'm really not trying to say this just to gross you out, but this really is a visual reminder of how sin is just gruesomely messy. And much like the blood of the animals, or if you're thinking glitter, think glitter, it gets everywhere it doesn't belong. Everywhere. You have a piece of it stuck to your forehead for 3 weeks. So in the case of these priests, they were the people who had to deal with the sin, although they weren't the ones who had committed it. The priests had special instructions for how then to deal with the bowls and the utensils that were used. They had instructions for how to wash their clothing, but keep in mind, it wasn't their sin they were dealing with. All of this work and all of this mess was about dealing with other people's sin. So back to feelings. When we've been deeply hurt or betrayed or violated by someone, our heart cries out in the aftermath of this that none of it is fair. And when you think about the work of forgiveness, it's easy to ask the question, and it's appropriate to ask the question, why should we have to work so hard to forgive and move on when they are the ones who hurt us? It's totally reasonable. And the answer, of course, and why we're the ones who have to do the work, is because sin is the actual worst. It's my theological assessment. People who didn't have anything to do with the sin get covered in it and are left to clean it up. But understand this, God knows this truth about sin. He's not surprised by it, and he's not surprised by the effect that sin has on us. God knows that the people who never asked for trouble are often the ones who are left to deal with it. It shouldn't surprise us that Jesus' first sermon in Matthew is the Sermon on the Mount, if we understand how God looks at sin. You can find the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, but Jesus says some things that really only make sense if he's talking to people who are hurting. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who are humble. Blessed are those who are merciful, those who work for peace." God is well aware of the ways that people behave and the suffering that they cause for others. Psalm 34:18 says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He rescues those whose spirits are crushed." I point your attention there because in chapter 4, Lisa talks about the prayer that she prayed as she was doing the work of forgiveness. And she gives us instructions to say, "I forgive so-and-so for what they did, and whatever my feelings don't yet allow for, the blood of Jesus will surely cover." I prayed a similar prayer again and again as well. Mine was a little bit different. I just prayed, "Lord, I forgive so-and-so. You know I don't feel like it right now, but I believe you'll get me there." And I have to tell you, he did. Eventually, and by continuing to pray that prayer, my feelings changed dramatically, and I felt like it. I felt like letting those things go. But I want to add this as well. What helped this to click for me, and what I hope will help this click for you, is taking a good look at Jesus on the cross. After everything Jesus suffered, and if you can, if you're willing, spend just a few uncomfortable moments there considering Jesus on the cross, and consider how, after everything Jesus endured, if the person who hurt me or if the person who hurt you were to go to Jesus and ask forgiveness, he'd give it. And if Jesus could offer that forgiveness after everything he endured, then I certainly didn't have the right, and my friend, you certainly don't have the right either to withhold forgiveness, no matter what we feel about it. I really think that in many ways, forgiveness is a willingness to just let the cross be enough. Now, assuming you're still with me, like Lisa writes, this whole forgiveness thing is a process. It'd be awesome if we could say that it was like getting a cavity filled, right? There's a little discomfort, but like 45 minutes, you're in, you're out, right? But it's not. Unfortunately, it's not. It's more like physical therapy, and you have to keep doing the exercises if you want to get better. Just like people will say that love is a choice that you make every day, when you're doing the work of forgiveness, you may find yourself making that choice several times a day at first. Then maybe you get to once a day, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. And eventually, whatever happened, it won't be the only thing you can think about. And that won't be because you stuffed it down so deep that it can't get to the surface. It'll actually be because you gave the pain back to Jesus and it just truly isn't a part of you anymore. It's possible. Forgiveness breaks that cycle of pain and chaos in your life, and it breaks the cycle in the lives of those around you. It means you get to experience joy and hope and peace, and maybe you even get to see beauty again. And while it might not be the easiest choice, every single time it's going to be the best. So thanks for watching. Take care. If you have any questions or need anything as you go through this material, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're praying for you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.